Dog interrupts a wedding. When the bride follows, she discovers a terrifying secret. The church bells echoed softly through the small village, blending harmoniously with the faint rustle of the breeze. It was the perfect day for a wedding. Crisp sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the pews below. Guests chatted excitedly, their laughter mingling with the organ music that filled the air. At the altar, the bride adjusted her veil, her heart pounding with both excitement and nerves. Everything seemed perfect until the dog appeared. It wasn't just any dog. It was a scruffy stray that had been wandering the village for weeks. No one knew where it came from, but it had a peculiar way of showing up in unexpected places, as if it was searching for something or someone. Today, it seemed, its search had brought it to the wedding. The first sign of trouble came when the dog trotted boldly through the open church doors. Heads turned, and a murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. The bride froze, her gaze locking on the dog's intense, almost human-like eyes. The animal didn't bark or growl. Instead, it stood there, staring at her as if trying to communicate something urgent. "Whose dog is that?" someone whispered, breaking the silence. The priest cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the ceremony. "Let's continue," he said, but his voice wavered slightly. The dog moved again, this time pacing toward the aisle. Its tail swished low, its posture tense. The guests watched in stunned silence as it stopped directly in front of the bride, letting out a single, sharp bark. The bride's face flushed with embarrassment. "Shoo!" she whispered, waving her hand. But the dog didn't budge. Instead, it barked again, louder this time, its gaze darting toward the back of the church. "What's going on?" the groom asked, his brow furrowing. Before anyone could answer, the dog turned abruptly and bolted out the door, barking furiously as if urging the bride to follow. A chill ran down her spine. Something about the dog's behavior felt wrong. "Wait," she said, lifting her skirt slightly as she stepped away from the altar. "I need to see what's going on." Gasps erupted from the crowd. "You can't just leave," her mother hissed, but the bride ignored them, her instincts pulling her toward the door. The dog was already halfway down the cobblestone path, pausing only to glance back at her, its eyes filled with a strange urgency. She hesitated for a moment, torn between the life she was about to start and the inexplicable pull to follow this mysterious animal. The whispers of the guests faded as she stepped outside. The dog barked again, this time running toward the edge of the forest at the village's outskirts. The bride hesitated only briefly before lifting her dress and running after it. The forest loomed ahead, its dense canopy blocking out the sunlight. Shadows danced across the ground as the dog disappeared into the trees. "Wait!" she called, her voice trembling. But the dog didn't stop. She took a deep breath and stepped into the forest. The air felt colder here, the silence oppressive. As she pushed through the underbrush, a single thought raced through her mind. What could possibly be so important? And then she saw it, a clearing ahead, bathed in an eerie golden light. The dog stood at the center, barking at something half buried in the ground. Her heart pounded as she approached, the edges of the clearing blurring as fear and curiosity took hold. What could be hidden here? The bride's heart raced as she stepped deeper into the clearing. The dog's barks grew more frantic, its body tense as it pawed at the earth beneath it. It was as if the animal knew something she didn't, a secret buried right beneath her feet. Her breath came out in shallow bursts, the forest around her silent except for the dog's insistent growls. Her pulse quickened with every step, her mind racing through 1,000 possibilities. Why had the dog led her here? As she approached, the dog stopped and stepped aside, its eyes locked on her with an almost knowing look. Her hands trembled as she knelt down to examine the ground. The dirt was loose, as if something had recently been disturbed. There, just below the surface, she saw the edge of something dark, a corner of a box that didn't belong. Her stomach churned. "What is this?" With a quick, nervous glance over her shoulder, she grabbed a nearby branch and began to pry at the earth. The dog sat patiently beside her, watching intently as she dug. After a few moments, she uncovered a small weathered wooden box, its edges frayed and old, as if it had been buried for years. The air around her seemed to thicken, the trees towering above her like silent witnesses to some forgotten truth. She hesitated. Should she open it? What if this was some kind of trap? But the dog's unblinking gaze seemed to urge her forward, and with a deep breath she removed the lid. Inside she found a collection of items that made her stomach turn. There was an old, faded photograph, two people standing close together, their faces blurred but their hands tightly clasped. The man in the photo looked familiar, but she couldn't place him. Beside the photograph there was a small, yellowing letter, its edges curling with age. The bride's fingers trembled as she unfolded it, reading the scrawled words that seemed to make her heart skip a beat. "I can't let you leave. We'll be together forever." Her breath caught in her throat. The words seemed to drip with an unsettling promise, one that chilled her to the core. She turned the letter over, but there was no signature, only a strange symbol etched into the back, a crescent moon intertwined with a star. The symbol was unfamiliar, yet it seemed to pull at something deep within her. She stood up, her body shaking, and turned toward the dog. "What is all this?" she whispered, though she knew it couldn't answer her. The animal only stared back, its eyes never leaving hers. Suddenly, a rustling noise broke the heavy silence. She spun around, her heart leaping in her chest. Someone was coming. She barely had time to hide the box before a shadow emerged from the edge of the clearing. It was the groom. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and urgency. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice trembling. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her gaze fell to the ground, to the box she had just uncovered. It was as if a veil had been lifted from her eyes. This man, the one she was about to marry, wasn't who he claimed to be. "What's going on?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The groom took a step toward her, his eyes flicking nervously to the dog. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered. His tone had shifted from loving to cold, and there was something in his gaze that sent a shiver down her spine. "I found something," she said, her voice steady now. "What is this box? What's in the photo?" The groom froze, his face draining of color. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate, as if weighing his options. Then, without warning, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver key. The kind of key you'd find in an old chest, one that didn't belong in a modern world. "This," he said softly, "is the key to everything." Her mind raced. The key? To what? Before she could ask another question, the sound of footsteps approaching grew louder. She looked toward the edge of the clearing and saw another figure emerging from the trees. It was the priest. His face was grim, his eyes avoiding hers as if he already knew what she had uncovered. The dog, sensing the tension, let out a low growl, its stance protective. The bride stood her ground, clutching the letter tightly in her hand. Something was wrong, and she knew it. "Father," she said, her voice shaking, "what is happening? Why is he—" But the priest raised his hand, cutting her off. "You need to leave, child," he said, his voice low and serious. "It's not safe for you here. None of this is what it seems." The words hung in the air like a thick fog, heavy with the weight of hidden truths. The groom's expression twisted with unease, and the priest's eyes flickered to the dog with a look of fear. "What aren't you telling me?" she demanded, her heart pounding in her chest. The groom stepped forward, his face now a mask of determination. "You need to stop asking questions. You're better off not knowing the truth." But the dog barked again, its voice sharp and insistent. It wasn't going to let them hide anymore. "Please," the bride said, her voice breaking, "tell me what's going on." Just then, a distant cry echoed through the trees, a sound so eerie and haunting that it sent a chill down her spine. "What was that?" she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. The priest's face paled even further. "You need to leave now," he said urgently, grabbing her arm. "This is bigger than you think." But the bride refused to move. She had to know the truth. The eerie cry echoed once again through the trees, followed by a deep silence. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with something sinister. The dog's growls deepened into a low, warning rumble, and the groom's hand tightened around the key in his pocket. The bride's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to make sense of the chaos around her. "Please," she whispered, turning her eyes to the groom. What's going on? Who are you really? The groom's face twisted in frustration, as if he were caught between fear and a desperate need to keep the truth hidden. The priest, still standing several feet behind, nodded gravely, his face pale as he stepped forward. His words were slow and careful, as if each one weighed heavy with the burden of a dark secret. "She needs to know," the priest said softly, his voice trembling. "She deserves the truth." The groom looked at the priest, eyes wide with panic. "You don't understand," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else. "She can't know. It's too dangerous. The ritual must continue." The bride stared at him, her confusion growing. "Ritual," she repeated, her voice rising. "What are you talking about?" The priest sighed, his shoulders slumping with the weight of years of hidden guilt. "You have to listen," he said urgently. "You were never meant to marry him. This wedding, this place, it's all part of something much darker. He's not who you think he is." The groom took a step back, eyes flickering to the dog, which now stood fully between the bride and him, its posture protective, as though it sensed the danger looming. "You were supposed to be part of a plan," the priest continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "A plan to summon something ancient. And this," he gestured to the groom, "he's the one who's been chosen to carry out the ritual. But it all depends on you." The bride's blood ran cold. "No, no, this can't be real. You're lying," she stammered, but deep down, a terrifying suspicion began to form. The priest's eyes locked with hers, filled with an apology she couldn't understand. "It's true," he said, his voice strained. "The moment you met him, you unknowingly became part of something that goes back centuries. He's not human, at least, not in the way you think. He's the vessel, the one meant to bring forth something else." Her body shook, her mind spinning, trying to grasp what the priest was saying. The words felt foreign, like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The groom stepped forward, his face now contorted in something like desperation. "Stop!" he shouted, as if trying to silence the truth before it could fully take root. "You have no idea what you're talking about. This isn't how it was supposed to happen. We were supposed to be together, and everything was supposed to go right." But the dog growled again, and the bride could feel her skin crawl with the weight of everything she was hearing. She glanced down at the wooden box she had found earlier, the photograph now pressed tightly in her hand. The faded picture of two people. Who were they? Was one of them him? Was the other her? The groom's voice lowered to a whisper, his eyes wild now. "I didn't want you to find out like this, but now there's no turning back. It's too late for both of us." The priest's eyes softened, and he reached for her arm, his grip gentle. "You need to leave now. It's not safe here." But the bride shook her head, pulling away from him. "No, I'm not going anywhere until I know the whole truth. I need to understand." The dog barked again, sharply, its gaze fixed on the groom. It was as if the animal was trying to warn her, urging her to listen, to trust its instincts. The more the dog growled, the more the groom's expression shifted from panic to something darker. His hands clenched into fists, and for the first time, she saw the real fear in his eyes, the fear of being exposed. "You don't understand," the groom said again, his voice hollow now. "This is bigger than both of us. The ritual, it's already in motion. I was supposed to protect you, to keep you safe, but I failed. The ritual won't stop, and neither will the consequences." She took a step back, the truth finally hitting her like a cold wave. The man she had been about to marry, he wasn't who he seemed. He was part of something ancient, something terrifying, something that would never let her go. This wedding was never about love. It had always been about power. And now, everything around her, the dog, the priest, the forest, it was all part of a dangerous game she had unwittingly stepped into. "How you can't run from it," the groom said, his voice dark and foreboding. "The moment you found the box, you became part of this. You can't escape the ritual. You never could." She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but her heart was racing. The ground beneath her felt unstable, as though the earth itself was shifting beneath her feet. She looked at the dog one more time. Its eyes filled with an ancient wisdom, and she knew it had always known. And then it all came crashing down. The groom's face twisted into a hideous grin, his features morphing into something unnatural, something monstrous. His human disguise was slipping away, revealing what he truly was, a creature of darkness, its true form hidden beneath the veneer of the man she thought she knew. Her scream was the last thing the forest heard before everything went black. The storm had finally passed, leaving the forest shrouded in an eerie, unnatural calm. The bride's heart was still pounding, her breath coming in shaky gasps as she slowly opened her eyes. The world around her was silent, save for the distant rustle of the leaves in the wind. It was as though time had stopped, waiting for her to find her way back to reality. Her hands were trembling as she pushed herself up from the ground. She could still feel the sharp sting of the revelation, the terrifying truth of what she had just uncovered. The groom, or whatever he had truly been, was gone, vanished into the night like a ghost. But it wasn't over. The images in her mind were too vivid, too real. She could still see the twisted face of the creature he had become, the grin that haunted her every thought. She wasn't sure whether the ritual was complete or if it had just begun. Either way, she knew one thing for certain. The life she had once known was shattered and everything had changed. The dog stood at her side, its warm, steady presence grounding her. She reached down to pet it, her fingers brushing through its fur, feeling the comfort it offered. The dog had been her only true ally in this chaos, its loyalty unwavering even when the world around them crumbled. The bond they shared was deeper now, more than just a pet and its owner. It was something sacred, something that had carried her through the darkness. But even in the stillness, the questions remained. What had the groom been? What was the true nature of the ritual that had nearly consumed her? And why had she been chosen? The priest approached cautiously, his steps slow as though he were afraid of what might happen next. His face was still pale, regret lingering in his eyes. "I should have told you sooner," he said softly, his voice laced with sorrow. "I never wanted this for you. I never wanted anyone to get caught in this curse." The bride didn't answer. There were no words that could make sense of what had happened, no way to explain the darkness she had witnessed. She simply nodded, her thoughts still racing. "Will you be okay?" the priest asked, his voice uncertain. She stared at him for a long moment, her mind still spinning. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I know one thing, I won't let him win. Whatever he was, whatever he tried to do, I won't be part of it. I'll find a way to stop it." The priest nodded, his face filled with both relief and sadness. "You're stronger than you know," he said quietly. The bride turned to the dog, who was watching her with wise, understanding eyes. It was as if the animal knew what had happened, knew the weight of what lay ahead. She knew the road would be long, that the danger wasn't truly over, but she was no longer alone. The dog would stay by her side, and together they would face whatever came next. With the first rays of dawn breaking through the trees, the bride took a deep breath and stood tall. The mystery was far from over, but the truth had set her on a new path. She would fight to uncover the darkness that had nearly claimed her, and she would bring an end to it, no matter the cost. The journey ahead was uncertain, but she was no longer afraid, and as the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the promise of change, the dog barked once more, its voice strong and sure. Together, they would face whatever the future held, and no matter how dark, they would find their way through it. What do you think the bride's next move will be? Can she truly escape the curse, or is the darkness just beginning? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more suspenseful stories.